Martha Jane Canary or Cannary, better known as Calamity Jane, was an American frontierswoman and professional scout, known for her claim of being an acquaintance of Wild Bill Hickok and for fighting Indians. She is said to have also exhibited kindness and compassion, especially to the sick and needy. This contrast helped to make her a famous frontier figure. Early life, 1852–1868. Much of the information about this period of Calamity Jane's life comes from the autobiographical booklet she dictated many years later, in 1896. The booklet was written for publicity purposes. She was about to begin a tour in which she would appear in dime museums around the country, and the pamphlet was intended to help attract audiences. Some of the information in the pamphlet is exaggerated or even completely inaccurate. Calamity Jane was born May 1, 1852, as Martha Jane Canary in Princeton, within Mercer County, Missouri. Her parents, Robert W. and Charlotte Cannary, were listed in the 1860 census as living about 7 miles further northeast of Princeton in Ravenna. Martha Jane was the eldest of 6 children, having 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In 1865, Robert packed his family and moved by wagon train from Missouri to Virginia City, Montana. Charlotte died along the way in Blackfoot, Montana, in 1866 of washtub pneumonia. After arriving in Virginia City in the spring of 1866, Robert took his 6 children on to Salt Lake City, Utah. They arrived in the summer, and Robert supposedly started farming on 40 acres of land. They were there only a year before he died in 1867. Martha Jane took over as head of the family, loaded up the wagon once more, and took her siblings to Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory. They arrived in May 1868. From there they traveled on the Union Pacific Railroad to Piedmont, Wyoming. In Piedmont, Martha Jane took whatever jobs she could to provide for her large family. She worked as a dishwasher, a cook, a waitress, a dancehall girl, a nurse, and an ox team driver. Finally, in 1874, she found work as a scout at Fort Russell. During this time, Jane also began her on-and-off employment as a prostitute at the Fort Laramie 3-Mile Hog Ranch. In 1865 we emigrated from our homes in Missouri by the overland route to Virginia City, Montana, taking 5 months to make the journey. While on the way, the greater portion of my time was spent in hunting along with the men and hunters of the party. In fact, I was at all times with the men when there was excitement and adventures to be had. By the time we reached Virginia City, I was considered a remarkable good shot and a fearless rider for a girl of my age. I remember many occurrences on the journey from Missouri to Montana. Many times in crossing the mountains, the conditions of the trail were so bad that we frequently had to lower the wagons over ledges by hand with ropes, for they were so rough and rugged that horses were of no use. We also had many exciting times fording streams, for many of the streams in our way were noted for quicksands and boggy places, where, unless we were very careful, we would have lost horses and all. Then we had many dangers to encounter in the way of streams swelling on account of heavy rains. On occasions of that kind, the men would usually select the best places to cross the streams. Myself, on more than one occasion, have mounted my pony and swam across the stream several times merely to amuse myself, and have had many narrow escapes from having both myself and pony washed away to certain death, but, as the pioneers of those days had plenty of courage, we overcame all obstacles and reached Virginia City in safety. Mother died at Blackfoot, Montana, 1866, where we buried her. I left Montana in spring of 1866, for Utah, arriving at Salt Lake City during the summer. Accounts from this period described Martha Jane as being extremely attractive, and a pretty, dark-eyed girl. Martha Jane received little to no formal education and was illiterate. She moved on to a rougher, mostly outdoor adventurous life on the Great Plains. Acquiring the nickname Martha Jane was involved in several campaigns in the long-running military conflicts with Native American Indians. Her unconfirmed claim was that, it was during this campaign, in 1872–1873, that I was christened Calamity Jane. It was on Goose Creek, Wyoming where the town of Sheridan is now located. Captain Egan was in command of the post. We were ordered out to quell an uprising of the Indians, and were out for several days, had numerous skirmishes during which 6 of the soldiers were killed and several severely wounded. When on returning to the post we were ambushed about 1.5 miles from our destination. When fired upon, Captain Egan was shot. I was riding in advance and on hearing the firing turned in my saddle and saw the captain reeling in his saddle as though about to fall. I turned my horse and galloped back with all haste to his side and got there in time to catch him as he was falling. I lifted him onto my horse in front of me and succeeded in getting him safely to the fort. Capt. Egan on recovering, laughingly said, "I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains. I have borne that name up to the present time." As reported in the Anaconda Standard, Captain Jack Crawford, who served under both Generals Wesley Merritt and George Crook, stated, "Calamity Jane never saw service in any capacity under either General Crook or General Miles. She never saw a lynching and never was in an Indian fight. She was simply a notorious character, dissolute and devilish, but possessed a generous streak which made her popular. It may be that she exaggerated or completely fabricated this story. Even back then not everyone accepted her version as true. A popular belief is that she instead acquired it as a result of her warnings to men that to offend her was to court calamity. It appears possible that Jane was not part of her name until the nickname was coined for her. She certainly was known by that nickname by 1876, because the arrival of the Hickok wagon train was reported in the Deadwood newspaper, the Black Hills Pioneer, on July 15, 1876, with the headline, "Calamity Jane has arrived." Another unverified story in her autobiographical pamphlet is that in 1875 her detachment was ordered to the Bighorn River, under General Crook. Bearing important dispatches, she swam the Platte River and traveled 90 miles at top speed while wet and cold to deliver them. Afterwards, she became ill. Calamity said that after recuperating for a few weeks, she rode to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and later, in July 1876, she joined a wagon train headed north. The second part of her story is true. She was at Fort Laramie in July 1876 and did join a wagon train that included Wild Bill Hickok. That is where she first met Wild Bill Hickok, contrary to her later claims, and it is how she happened to come to Deadwood. Deadwood and Wild Bill Hickok, 1876–1881, Calamity Jane accompanied the Newton Jenny Party into the Black Hills in 1875, along with California Joe and Valentine McGillicuddy. By this time her youthful good looks were gone. Her skin was leathery and tanned from sun and wind, she was muscular and masculine, and her hair was stringy and seldom washed. In 1876, Calamity Jane settled in the area of Deadwood, South Dakota, in the Black Hills. There, she became friends with, and was occasionally employed by, Dora Dufran, the Black Hills' leading madam. She became friendly with Wild Bill Hickok and Charlie Utter, having traveled with them to Deadwood in Utter's wagon train. Jane greatly admired Hickok. The McCormick claim, on September 6, 1941, the U.S. Department of Public Welfare granted old age assistance to a Jane Hickok Burkhart McCormick, who claimed to be the legal offspring of Martha Jane Cannary and James Butler Hickok, after being presented with evidence that Calamity Jane and Wild Bill had married at Benson's Landing, Montana Territory, on September 25, 1873. The documentation was written in a Bible and presumably signed by 2 ministers and numerous witnesses. However, McCormick's claim has been vigorously challenged because of a variety of discrepancies. McCormick later published a book with letters purported to be from Calamity Jane to her daughter. In them, Calamity Jane says she had been married to Hickok and Hickok was the father of McCormick, who was born September 25, 1873 and given up for adoption to a Captain Jim Unal and his wife. No records are known to exist which prove the birth of a child or establish the existence of Captain Unal. During the period when the alleged child was born, Calamity Jane was working as a scout for the Army, and at the time of Hickok's death, he was newly married to Agnes Lake Thatcher. Although the father's identity is uncertain, Calamity does seem to have had a daughter. In the late 1880s, Calamity Jane returned to Deadwood with a child she claimed was her daughter. At her request, a benefit was held in one of the theaters to raise money for the daughter's education in St. Martin's Academy at Sturgis, a nearby Catholic boarding school. The benefit raised a large sum. Calamity got drunk and spent a considerable portion of it that same night and left with the child the next day. Esteline Bennett, who lived in Deadwood at the time and had spoken briefly to Calamity a few days before the benefit, believed Calamity honestly wanted to educate her daughter, and that the drunken binge was just an example of Calamity's inability to cope her impulses and carry through long-range plans. Bennett heard later that Calamity's daughter did in fact get an education, and grew up and married well. After the death of Wild Bill Hickok, Jane also claimed that following Hickok's death, she went after Jack McCall, his murderer, with a meat cleaver, having left her guns at her residence in the excitement of the moment. However, she never confronted McCall. Following McCall's eventual hanging for the offense, Jane continued living in the Deadwood area for some time, and at one point she did help save several passengers in an overland stagecoach by diverting several Plains Indians who were in pursuit of the vehicle. The stagecoach driver, John Slaughter, was killed during the pursuit, and Jane took over the reins and drove the stage onto its destination at Deadwood. Also in late 1876 or 1878, Jane nursed the victims of a smallpox epidemic in the Deadwood area. Citation needed. Date equals June 2014. Cite book Esteline Bennett, Old Deadwood Days, Lincoln, Nebraska and London, University of Nebraska Press, 1982, pages 222 to 224. Date of 1878 found on pages 223. This book has been published a number of times, originally published J. H. Sears, 1928. Republished by Charles Scribner's Sons, 1935. Later republished by Narrative Press, 2001. Final years, 1881–1903. In 1881, Jane bought a ranch west of Miles City, Montana, along the Yellowstone River, where she kept an inn. After marrying the Texan Clinton Burke and moving to Boulder, she again tried her luck in this business. In 1887, she had a daughter, Jane, who was given to foster parents. In 1893, Calamity Jane started to appear in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show as a storyteller. She also participated in the 1901 Pan American Exposition. At that time, she was depressed and an alcoholic. Jane's addiction to liquor was evident even in her younger years. For example, on June 10, 1876, she rented a horse and buggy in Cheyenne for a mile or so joyride to Fort Russell and back, but Calamity was so drunk that she passed right by her destination without noticing it and finally ended up about 90 miles away at Fort Laramie. By the start of the 20th century, brothel Madame Dora Dufran was still going strong when Jane returned to the Black Hills in the early spring of 1903. For the next few months, Jane earned her keep by cooking and doing the laundry for Dora unregistered trademark S brothel girls in Belfrush. In late July, Jane traveled by train to Terry, South Dakota, a small mining village near Deadwood. While staying in the Culloway Hotel on August 1, 1903, she died at the age of 51. It was reported that she had been drinking heavily on board the train and became very sick to her stomach. The train's conductor carried her off the train, a bartender secured a room for her at the Culloway Hotel, and a doctor was summoned. She died soon afterward, on Saturday, August 1, 1903, from inflammation of the bowels and pneumonia. Allegedly, found among her meager belongings was a bundle of unsent letters to her daughter. Some of these letters were set to music in an art song cycle by 20th-century composer Libby Larsen called Songs from Letters. Calamity Jane was buried at Mount Moriah Cemetery, South Dakota, next to Wild Bill Hickok. 4 of the men who planned her funeral later stated that since Wild Bill Hickok had absolutely no use for Jane while he was alive, they decided to play a posthumous joke on Hickok by giving Calamity an eternal resting place by his side. Another account states, in compliance with Jane's dying requests, the Society of Black Hills Pioneers took charge of her funeral and burial in Mount Moriah Cemetery beside Wild Bill. not just old friends, but the morbidly curious and many who will unregistered trademark T have acknowledged Calamity Jane when she was alive, overflowed the First Methodist Church for the August 4 funeral services and followed the hearse up the steep winding road to Deadwood, unregistered trademark S. Boot Hill. Additional information: Calamity Jane was a frequent visitor to and sometimes resident of Livingston, Montana and towns in the Paradise Valley. She came up from a very hard-scrabble life, unacquainted with bourgeois notions of decorum. She probably never knew financial security, but even in poverty she was known for her helpfulness, generosity, and willingness to undertake demanding and even dangerous tasks to help others. She was afflicted with alcoholism and wanderlust, but, as someone remembered her, her vices were the wide-open sins of a wide-open county, the sort that never carried a hurt. Autobiography: Calamity Jane, as she became known, lived a very colorful and eventful life but often claimed questionable associations or friendships with notable famous American Old West figures, almost always posthumously. For example, years after the death of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, she claimed that she served under him during her initial enlistment at Fort Russell, and that she also served under him during the Indian campaigns in Arizona. However, no records exist to show that Custer was assigned to Fort Russell, and he did not take an active part in the Arizona Indian campaigns. He was given the task of subjugating the Plains Indians. In 1896 she joined the traveling Cole and Middleton Dime Museum as a performer, and a 7-page souvenir booklet was sold by that circus, titled The Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane by herself. It was almost certainly written by someone else, as there is no reliable evidence that Jane could read and write. It is this booklet that is described, rather generously, as her autobiography. The booklet misstates her birth name, her birthdate, and misspells Missouri repeatedly. Several of the stories in the booklet are unsupported, or even contradicted, by reliable evidence. Unlike Annie Oakley, her performances did not involve sharpshooting or roping or riding, merely Jane appearing on stage in buckskins and reciting her adventures which metastasized with each telling in colorful but clean language. However, after about 6 months her increasing drinking and profanity ended her career as a stage performer. Her reputation for embellishing her accomplishments, and the willingness of some others to attribute to her even more fanciful adventures, have made it very difficult to determine the true facts of her life. Historians have been unable to locate sufficient information to determine the truth about disputed events, and in many instances independent sources completely contradict her own accounts. Major media representations: films. The Plainsman is a 1936 film starring Gary Cooper as Wild Bill Hickok and Jean Arthur as Calamity Jane. In Young Bill Hickok with Roy Rogers, she was portrayed by Sally Payne. Calamity Jane was played by Jane Russell in the 1948 comedy movie The Pale Face. Calamity Jane and Sam Bass was a 1949 film. Calamity was played by Yvonne DiCarlo, Sam Bass by Howard Duff. Calamity Jane was a 1953 musical western film from Warner Brothers Studios starring Doris Day in the title role and Howard Keel as Wild Bill Hickok. It won the Best Song Oscar for the song Secret Love, by Sammy Fain and Paul Francis Webster. In the 1975 movie Death Race 2000, Calamity Jane was the name of one of the racers and was portrayed by Mary Woronov. In the 1995 Disney movie Tall Tale, The Unbelievable Adventures of Pecos Bill, she was portrayed by actress Catherine O'Hara as a mythic figure, acquainted with Paul Bunyan and John Henry, and as Pecos Bill's jilted sweetheart and as a sheriff or deputy of some sort. In the 1995 film Wild Bill, Calamity Jane was portrayed by actress Ellen Barkin. Jane was portrayed in the 2009 French movie Lucky Luke. Games. In Call of Duty, Black Ops Zombies mode, the Pack-a-Punched CZ-75s are called Calamity and Jane. Fallout 3 includes a reference to Calamity Jane by talking with the sheriff in Megaton. In the Facebook application Frontierville there is a suit-like outfit for female characters called the Calamity Jane outfit. She appeared as a side character in the computer RPG Worlds of Ultima, Martian Dreams. Parasite Eve 2 includes a reference to Calamity Jane when users check a portrait on one of the motel rooms, once the user acquires the master key. In the King's Isle entertainment game Pirate 101, Calamity Jane is one of the Magnificent Seven. Calamity Jane appeared as a side main character in the video game Wild Arms. Literature, books. Calamity Jane was an important fictional character in the Deadwood Dick series of dime novels, beginning with the first appearance of Deadwood Dick in Beadle's Half-Dime Library issue No. 1 in 1877. This series, written by Edward Wheeler, established her with a reputation as a Wild North vacation heroine and probably did more to enhance her familiarity to the public than any of her real-life exploits. Calamity Jane was the title character in serial published in New York Street and Smith's Weekly under the title, Calamity Jane, Queen of the Plains, by the author Reckless Ralph. The science fiction writer A. Bertram Chandler included a character named Calamity Jane Arlen in his far future novels set on the frontier rim worlds, a space analogue of the Old West. A fictitious fight between Calamity Jane and an imposter is depicted in Thomas Berger's novel Little Big Man. Jane is the central character in Larry McMurtry's book Buffalo Girls, a novel. Jane is a central character in Pete Dexter's novel Deadwood, which was the basis for the HBO series Deadwood. J.T. Edson features Calamity Jane as a character in a number of his books, as a standalone character and as a romantic interest of the character Mark Counter. An alternate universe version of Jane as a character in the short story Deadwood in Corsets and Clockwork, a steampunk anthology. The story also features Jesse James. In Calamity's Wake, a novel of historical fiction written by Natalie Capel, Martha, or Calamity Jane, is one of two main narrators. The other is Jane's daughter Met. Calamity Jane is the name that James Bond gives to his putter in the novel Goldfinger, by Ian Fleming, due to its inaccuracy. Comics. Calamity Jane figures as a main character in an album of the same name of the Franco-Belgian comic series Lucky Luke, created by Morris and Goscinny. Music. Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok are featured in the song Deadwood Mountain by the country duo Big and Rich. Some of her purported letters were set to music in an art song cycle by 20th-century composer Libby Larsen, called Songs from Letters. Soprano Dora Orenstein commissioned 5 pieces compiled under the title Urban Diva. The second piece, Ben Johnston's Calamity Jane to her daughter, is a theatrical setting of selected letters. Calamity Jane is referenced in a song by Bob Schneider called Getting Better. Calamity Jane is referenced in a song by the Magnetic Fields called Two Characters in Search of a Country Song. Calamity Jane is a song by Keia Hartwood on Wishing Chair's Underdog CD. Alain Bashung, Chloe copyright Mons. Rodolphe Berger released the album La Ballade de Calamity Jane based on Jane's letters to her daughter. Calamity Jane is a song by Czech rock band Carber T. Television. The name Calamity is given to the children's character played by Nancy Gilbert in the 1955 to 1956 syndicated television series, Buffalo Bill, Jr., with Dick Jones as the fictitious Buffalo Bill, Jr., and Harry Cheshire as Judge Ben Fair and Square Wally. In the episode Calamity of the ABC Warner Brothers Western series, Cold Point 45, Dodie Heath is cast as Calamity Jane and Joan Taylor as a woman doctor, Ellen McGraw. In the storyline, series character Christopher Colt, played by Wade Preston, hires Calamity Jane to drive the stagecoach containing Dr. McGraw and the vaccine needed for the smallpox outbreak in Deadwood. Colt is unsure if Calamity can handle the job because miners and Indians seek to steal the valuable medication. Season 5 of Have Gun, Will Travel included an episode called The Cure with an alcoholic Jane seeking revenge from a promoter who had replaced the real Jane with a younger woman. In an episode of Bonanza, Calamity Over the Comstock, Stephanie Powers plays Calamity Jane, who visits Virginia City along with Doc Holliday. In this primarily comedic episode, she is rescued by Little Joe, who at first thinks she is a male. She becomes infatuated with him, and he receives threats from Doc, who covets Jane for himself. At her urging, Doc demurs from facing down Joe, and Jane and Doc exit town. No official or unofficial documentation exists suggesting that Doc Holliday and Jane ever met during their lifetimes. it is highly unlikely that they met considering the geographical distances between them during their lives. The television movie Calamity Jane featured her life story, including her alleged marriage to Wild Bill Hickok and the daughter she purportedly gave up. Actress Jane Alexander portrayed Calamity and was nominated for an Emmy in 1985 for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Limited Series or Special. The show also featured an early performance of Sarah Gilbert as Calamity's daughter, Jean, at age 7. Jane is the central character in Larry McMurtry's book Buffalo Girls, a novel, and in the 1995 TV adaptation of the same name, Jane is played by Anjelica Huston, with Sam Elliott as Wild Bill Hickok. In 1997 a cartoon series on Kids WB called The Legend of Calamity Jane depicted a young Jane. Jane, portrayed by Robin Weggett, was an important character in HBO's 2004 television series Deadwood. In 2012, the cartoon My Little Pony mentioned a character named Calamity Jane, meant to be a spoof of Calamity Jane. See also: List of female adventurers. References: Grisk, Michael. The Diaries of John Hunton. Heritage Books. ISBN A0-7884-3804-2. External links: works by Calamity Jane at Project Gutenberg.